So some people will say that, okay, well, this Pelagian guy, yeah, he was wrong, but Augustine, he went to, in reacting to Pelagius, he just went too far to, in the opposite direction. And he's saying stuff like, he uses the term guilt to refer to original sin, so that infants are guilty of this original sin. So what does Augustine mean by the term guilt, and also like liability and other terms like that, which he'll use to describe original sin?
Yeah, so Augustine does use the word guilt, but we want to get back to what is the original Latin that he's actually using that's being translated as guilt. And there's three Latin words that could all be translated guilt. So there's reus, culpa, and reatus. So reus is a crime that you have committed, essentially. Culpa is a moral fault. And reatus is the state of having been or being in reus, right? So you commit a crime, a reus. And reatus is now the punishment for that, or the guilt for that. So, and these are only very general, trying to grasp the English meanings of these, because part of the problem is that Augustine himself in his own life is trying to figure out how to separate these meanings. So initially, he actually uses the terms pretty much interchangeably. But when he actually gets into the debate with the Pelagians and wants to get more specific, he realizes we should make some distinction, right? Reus, a crime, or culpa, a fault. These are only things we can have through our personal actions. And these are only things we, essentially they're a fault or a guilt that we have. But he does keep reatus and use this for the guilt of original sin. And Augustine actually defines it as, quote, a liability for punishment, which is remitted in baptism. And so, in this sense, then, right, we become guilty of that original sin. So we are, in a sense, guilty of original sin, right? We have the punishment for it on us in the fact that we come from the human nature of Adam and Eve. However, there becomes actually an issue here, two real issues here. There's, first of all, the issue of earlier Latin church fathers had used reus and culpa for original sin. And actually, the Latin Bible, which was popular at the time, this is shortly before the Vulgate, it also used reus in passages that clearly referred to original sin. So at this point, Augustine says there's still the distinction, but it's not so much a linguistic distinction as something we have to be more clear to define. So another quote from Augustine here he has is that no matter whence born, a man is innocent because there is no personal sin, but he is guilty or reum through original sin. Right? So it's actually not that Augustine actually wants to avoid using guilt in a legal sense for original sin, but he's actually sort of forced into it because other church fathers had already used it that way. And the scriptures, as they were read by Latin Christians at the time, already used it that way. And so he ends up making this important distinction between original sin and a personal sin, which he doesn't really have a consistent word for. The Latin tradition actually later calls this actual sin, right? Sin that we have done through our activity.